Right now, as you're watching this, the price of everything you buy, your gas, your groceries, your heating, is being driven higher because 1/5 of the world's oil supply has been completely shut down. And the country responsible for that shutdown just demanded that Canada and every other ally send warships to clean up the mess. Not a request, not a negotiation, a demand backed by a threat. We will remember those words came directly from the President of the United States aboard Air Force One, aimed at every allied nation that has not obeyed. Let that land for a moment. And while that threat was being made, our Prime Minister was doing something radically different. Last week, Mark Carney stood on a frozen NATO base in Norway with the German Chancellor. This weekend, he sat down with 5 Nordic leaders in Oslo. Monday morning, he walked into 10 Downing Street with the British Prime Minister. 3 stops, 3 sets of allies, and at every single one, the same message. Canada will stand with its partners. Canada will not be commanded. Then one by one, every ally Carney had just met with looked at Washington and said one word, no. Not one country obeyed, not one. This has been confirmed by Reuters, the Associated Press, CNN, the BBC, and the Financial Times. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what each country said back, why one response is being called the most devastating public rebuke of an American president in NATO history, and what our Prime Minister was quietly building while it all unfolded. Subscribe and hit the bell. This is the story that matters right now. Here's how we got here. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched military operations against Iran. No ally was consulted, no coalition was formed, no plan was shared, and within days, Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow waterway carries 20% of the world's oil, 1,000 tankers stranded. In the last 24 hours, 0 vessels made it through, 0, down from 60 per day. This is not a disruption. This is not a slowdown. This is a complete shutdown. Oil prices surged past $100 a barrel. And instead of accepting the consequences of a decision he made alone, Trump turned to the very allies he never consulted and demanded they fix it. On Saturday, he posted on social media calling on China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others to send their warships. Then, in an interview with the Financial Times, he said, "If allies do not respond, it will be very bad for the future of NATO." Think about that for a moment. The country that launched operations without asking a single ally is now threatening those same allies for not volunteering their navies. With what plan to reopen the strait? According to U.S. Senator Chris Murphy, they had no plan. With what consultation before the operations? None. With what right to demand the rest of the world clean up the consequences? That's the question every allied capital asked this week. And one by one, in public, on camera, they answered. Germany responded first and hardest. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, one of the most senior military officials in Europe, the same government whose chancellor stood beside Carney on that frozen NATO base 5 days ago, said this. What does Trump expect a handful of European frigates to do that the powerful U.S. Navy cannot do? This is not our war. We did not start it, not our war, from the country that just days earlier had been training alongside Canadian forces in the Arctic. That is not a diplomatic statement. That is a line in the sand. A spokesman for Chancellor Scholz added that this conflict has nothing to do with NATO. It is not NATO's responsibility, and it did not stop there. Japan's prime minister said there are no plans to dispatch ships. Australia said flatly they will not send ships. Italy's foreign minister said expanding operations should not happen. The EU's foreign policy chief said there is, and I quote, no appetite, not we're considering it. No appetite. And then came the United Kingdom, the very country where our prime minister was sitting Monday morning. Keir Starmer, standing at the same podium where he and Carney had just finished their meeting, told reporters Britain will not be drawn into the wider conflict. He said explicitly, this will not be a NATO mission. Let me say that again. Germany said no. Japan said no, Australia said no, Italy said no, the EU said no, and the United Kingdom, while hosting our prime minister, said no, every single one. Now, here's the detail that turns this from humiliating into devastating. Reuters has reported that the U.S. Navy itself has been refusing near daily requests from the shipping industry to escort vessels through the strait. The risk, according to those reports, is considered too high. Trump is demanding allied navies go where his own Navy will not, asking other countries to accept a risk America's own military considers too dangerous. That is the worst of both worlds. America will not send its own escorts through the strait, and it is threatening every ally that will not do it for them. Not one or the other, both. Meanwhile, our prime minister spent the past week doing the opposite of demanding. He showed up. In Norway, he trained alongside allied forces. In Oslo, he deepened defense partnerships with 5 Nordic nations. In London, he sat with Starmer and agreed on the need for cooperation, stability, and protecting shipping routes through diplomacy rather than demands. Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen publicly thanked Carney for Canada's leadership. Iceland's Prime Minister said there is a void in global leadership and Canada has been filling it. One leader demanded obedience and got silence. Another showed up, stood beside his allies, and was thanked for it. Now, I want to be fair because this matters. The Strait of Hormuz does need to be reopened. 1/5 of the world's oil is blocked. Prices above $100 a barrel hurt families everywhere, including here in Canada. But the question is not whether the strait should be reopened. Of course it should. The question is whether a country that launched operations without consulting a single ally has the right to demand those allies send their navies into the consequences. And here's what cannot be undone. Every refusal this week is on the public record. Germany's words are documented. Japan's rejection is official. Australia's refusal is confirmed. Britain's prime minister said on camera, "This will not be a NATO mission." And our prime minister was standing in Downing Street when he said it. Every defense agreement Carney signed in Norway has a timeline and a budget. Every partnership deepened in Oslo is permanent. Every ally that walked away from Trump walked toward Canada. Alliances do not wait. Trust does not wait. And the words, "This is not our war," do not disappear when the news cycle moves on. Let me walk you through what actually happened in each of those refusals, because the language matters as much as the decision itself. Germany's defense minister didn't just say no. He asked a question that no one in Washington could answer. What do you expect a handful of European frigates to do that the powerful U.S. Navy cannot do? That question exposes the fundamental absurdity of the demand. If the United States, with the most powerful Navy in human history, cannot safely escort tankers through the strait, what exactly are a few German ships supposed to accomplish? The answer, of course, is nothing. The demand was never about military effectiveness. It was about political cover. It was about making it look like someone else was sharing the burden of a crisis the United States created alone. Germany saw through it immediately. Japan's rejection was even more pointed in its brevity. No plans to dispatch ships. That's not diplomatic language for "we'll consider it." That's diplomatic language for "don't call us, we won't call you." Japan imports the vast majority of its oil through that strait. If any country has a direct interest in reopening it, Japan does. And yet, Japan still said no, because Japan understands that giving in to this demand would set a precedent. It would mean accepting that the United States can start wars alone and then demand others clean up the consequences. Australia's refusal was flat and unequivocal. Will not send ships. No hedging, no conditions, just no. Italy's foreign minister went further, saying expanding operations should not happen. That's not just a refusal, that's a rebuke. That's Italy saying the entire approach is wrong. The EU's foreign policy chief said there is no appetite. That phrase was chosen deliberately. It means the idea is not just rejected, it is unpopular, it is unwelcome, it has no support anywhere in the room. And then Britain's prime minister, standing at the same podium where he had just hosted Carney, said, "This will not be a NATO mission." That is the most significant of all, because Britain is America's closest military ally. If Britain says no, everyone says no. Here's what you need to understand about the timing. Carney was in London when Starmer made that statement. He was not hiding in Ottawa. He was not issuing a press release from across the ocean. He was standing in the room in the same building as the British Prime Minister told the world that this would not be a NATO mission. That is not a coincidence. That is diplomacy. That is the signal that Canada and the UK are aligned, that they see the situation the same way, that they will coordinate their responses. And while Trump was demanding obedience from the sky, Carney was building consensus on the ground. Let me give you the full picture of what Carney accomplished in the days before the crisis hit. Last week, he stood on a frozen NATO base in Norway with the German chancellor. They trained alongside allied forces. They talked about Arctic defense. They built the kind of personal relationships that matter when crises hit. This weekend, he sat down with the leaders of Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland in Oslo. 5 Nordic nations, all with deep interests in Arctic security, all with capable militaries, all with concerns about the direction of American foreign policy. Monday morning, he walked into 10 Downing Street with the British Prime Minister. They talked about trade, about defense, about the need for stability, 3 stops, 3 sets of allies. And in each one, Carney delivered the same message. Canada is reliable. Canada is predictable. Canada shows up. Now contrast that with the message coming from Washington. Obey or we will remember. Which message do you think allies want to hear? The response to Trump's demand was not just a series of no's. It was a series of affirmations of the approach Carney has been building. Every ally that refused Trump had just spent time with Carney. Every ally that said no to Washington had just said yes to deeper cooperation with Canada. That is not a coincidence. That is strategy. Denmark's prime minister publicly thanked Carney for Canada's leadership. Iceland's prime minister said there is a void in global leadership, and Canada has been filling it. Those are not throwaway lines. Those are statements of intent. They are signals that the Nordic countries see Canada as a more reliable partner than the United States under its current leadership. Let me be clear about what this means for the future. The refusals this week will not be forgotten. They will be cited in future negotiations. They will be referenced in alliance discussions. They will become part of the permanent record of how countries responded when the United States asked for help with a crisis of its own making. And every defense agreement Carney signed, every partnership he deepened, every relationship he built will still be there. Those agreements have timelines and budgets. Those partnerships have structures and commitments. Those relationships have trust, and trust once built is durable. What Trump demanded was obedience. What he got was a lesson in how alliances actually work. Alliances are not commands from a superior. Alliances are relationships between equals who share interests and values. When one partner stops acting like a partner and starts acting like a boss, the others do not obey. They walk away. That is what happened this week. Every ally walked away. And while they were walking away from Washington, they were walking toward Canada. Here's the part that should keep strategists in Washington awake at night. The Strait of Hormuz closure is not going to resolve itself. The oil is still blocked. The prices are still rising. And the United States has now publicly demonstrated that it cannot count on its allies to help. That is a strategic vulnerability of the First Order. If America's closest friends will not send ships to protect the world's most important oil choke point, what will they do when a real crisis hits? What will they do when the threat is not to oil shipments, but to NATO territory? The answer, based on this week, is not much. And Canada, through all of this, has positioned itself as the alternative, not as a rival to the United States, but as a partner that can be relied on, a country that shows up, a country that builds relationships, a country that does not demand obedience, but earns trust. That is why the Nordic countries thanked Carney by name. That is why the British Prime Minister stood with him. That is why every refusal of Trump's demand was also an affirmation of Canada's approach. One leader demanded. Every ally walked away. Another leader showed up. Every ally walked toward him. There is a lesson in that, and it is a lesson the world will not soon forget. Now, let me answer the question that is probably on your mind. What happens next? The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Oil prices remain elevated. The United States remains isolated, and the allies remain firm in their refusals. There are 3 possible paths forward. The first is that the United States, recognizing that it cannot force its allies to act, begins actual diplomatic engagement with Iran to reopen the strait. This would require setting aside the demands and threats and doing the hard work of negotiation. It is the sensible path, but it is not the path this administration has shown any interest in taking. The second is that the United States attempts to act alone, sending its own navy into the strait despite the risks. This could lead to direct confrontation with Iranian forces, escalation of the conflict, and further disruption of global oil supplies. It is the dangerous path, but it is the path consistent with the administration's rhetoric. The third is that nothing happens. The strait stays closed, oil prices stay high, the United States keeps demanding, the allies keep refusing, and the world slowly adjusts to a new reality in which American leadership is no longer the default, in which countries look elsewhere for reliable partners. Canada is ready for all 3 paths because Canada has been building relationships, diversifying partnerships, and positioning itself for whatever comes next. That is what leadership looks like. Not demands from 30,000 FT, but presence on the ground, not threats of retaliation, but promises of cooperation, not isolation, but alliance. What happened this week was not a failure of American policy. It was a demonstration of what American policy has become. Demands without consultation, threats without offers, isolation without awareness. And what happened this week was also a demonstration of what Canadian policy has become under Mark Carney. Presence, partnership, reliability. The contrast could not be more stark. And the world noticed, Germany noticed, Japan noticed, Australia noticed, Italy noticed, the EU noticed, Britain noticed, the Nordic countries noticed, and they all made their choice. They all walked away from the demand. They all walked toward the leader who showed up. One leader demanded obedience. Every ally walked away. Another leader showed up. And now Canada is at the center of the alliances that matter. That is the story of this week. That is the story you will not hear on most news networks. And that is the story that will define the next decade of global affairs. Where are you watching this from right now? Canada, Europe, somewhere else? Drop your location in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. What happened this week showed something the world needed to see. One leader demanded obedience and received nothing. Another leader showed up, stood with his allies, and was thanked by name. That is the difference, and that is Canada. Stay informed with BCC News. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a critical update.